Are you or your clients looking for a regular income solution with compelling returns to diversify your portfolio? If so, Neighborhood Holdings may be a great option for you. Listeners of this podcast will appreciate that public markets can be turbulent and finding a good private credit fund can be tough. But Neighborhood's track record, transparency, and investor alignment sets it apart from the pack. With nearly 10 years of consistent performance and a target net yield of 8 to 10%, Neighborhood has a track record of providing monthly income to investors without the volatility of public markets. How do they do this? Where banks invest in mortgages up to 95% loan to value, they also make borrowers jump through a lot of hoops. Many borrowers in transition aren't able to meet those hoops. Neighborhood has partnered with banks and brokers to provide quality borrowers with temporary financing secured by first mortgages at an average loan to value of less than 60%. Where other mortgage funds might take more risk by lending against construction, bare land, or jumbo loans, Neighborhood is focused on your average residential borrower who owns the average house in the neighborhood. Plus, their variable rate with a floor mortgage pricing benefits investors when interest rates go up and mitigates downside risk. Check out the link in the description or visit neighborhoodholdings.com to view the offering memorandum or speak to your financial advisor for more information. That's neighborhoodholdings.com/Loonie Hour. Before we get started, I just want to remind everyone that this information discussed today is not intended to be or construed as investment advice. Please consult a professional advisor before putting a loonie in any of these financial markets.
The dirty secret is that no one's ever going to get paid back.
People have the shortest memories when it comes to investment.
We just got to get Keith into Bitcoin. Hey, there's a bubble.
Welcome back to Loonie Hour, episode 180. As always, joined by the three amigos. We got the Boomer, IceCap Asset Management, Rich Diaz. What's going on?
Richard. Boomer. Oh, Richard. What's new?
I have an update for everybody. At the beginning of the year, I said I was going to read a bunch of books. And, if I'm honest, I didn't read anything in January. But I've read two books and I'd like to update. The first book is called Richard Nixon, The Life, which is a biography of Richard Nixon, which was a great book. I recommend it. 1968 and all that. One fun fact, Richard Nixon in his second term won 49 out of 50 states. He only didn't win Massachusetts because he was running against Ted Kennedy, I think. And the second book I read was Project Hail Mary, which is a sci-fi book. There you go. That's all I got for people today.
Exhilarating.
Well, we're working on 12 for the year. I said I was going to read 12 books, so we're at 2 right now.
I'd like to join you on that mission.
Okay. All right. Well, I'll give you that.
My first book I'm reading is Mark Carney, Values.
Really? Are you actually? Genuinely? No.
No, I did buy it, though, and I just out of curiosity, I have not read it. It's sitting on the old shelf, but election time coming around the corner. It's
so who sponsored the book? Which big bank? Which big NGO sponsored it?
The WEF sent it to me.
Well, do you want to know the name of the book I'm reading next? I'm going to tell you anyways. It's called Dominion, The Railway and the Rise of Canada. So it's called A Thrilling New Account of the Engineering Triumph That Created a Nation. So it's all about how the Canadian Pacific Railway built in the late 1800s, basically connected two parts of Canada.
Can't build that.
And I would argue that we need pipelines in the 21st century to do it again, but that's a conversation for a different day. Anyway, there you go.
Hey guys, Boomer is actually reading a book as well. Believe it or not.
Are you?
Yeah,
holy shit. There's definitely gonna be a timestamp on this one, eh?
Yeah, no. Stanley Tucci, Everything I Ate in 1 Year.
Oh, I've read that book. Great book. Oh, yeah. No, I've read a different Stanley Tucci book. But anyway, he's good. Okay. I like him.
Yeah, all right, I don't find he's likable.
Okay.
No. It's too British. Too much British stuff in it.
Enough of your
Hey, Steve, line us up.
Yeah, enough
line
of your
us up,
book
guys.
Recommendations. We've got lots going on. Tons going on. We've got a special guest today, second time on the pod, Brent Johnson, the milkshake man on Twitter. He'll come on, so we'll chat about US-Canada relations, bond markets, the Fed. Obviously, they just came out this week, so Brent will sort of provide some perspective there, at least from a money manager's perspective as well. I think that best part about guys like Brent is you have to look at global events objectively, because at the end of the day, it's like you're using these events to manage money and place bets. So you have to kind of strip your emotions and feelings out of it, which most Canadians cannot do, as we're seeing with these upcoming elections, my Twitter feed is just berated with horribly bad takes from all sides. And it's going to be interesting. We just had the election leaked today. The Globe and Mail came out today saying that Mark Carney is in fact expected to call an election this Sunday, with the election expected, I believe, for April 28th, or they're saying potentially May 5th, I believe, is when voters will go to the polls. So we'll see.
Well, in my riding, my riding is currently vacant. That the guy that was
Get in there.
the MP, yeah, if I ever run for politics, you have my permission to punch me right in the between the two eyes. I'd never do that. But I would gladly comment on everything though. Anyway, but our riding is the MP stepped down a few months back. So believe it or not, right now they're out campaigning for a by-election.
Huh?
Which means as soon as that's over, then they'll have to do it all over again, for the real election.
That doesn't seem smart or efficient.
Aha, that's right.
That was my mistake.
Oh, Rich, you're still naive about
Yeah, I'm
things.
very naive. It's true.
Anyway, there are a whole bunch of red signs in my neighborhood. And there's a few orange ones as well.
Man, those orange guys are really
No blue. No blue at all. No blue. Red and orange down this way.
What are you doing over there? We got to get you out. We got to go save this guy. Send a boat over.
Yeah, but now I'm the interesting guy. That's who I am. And yeah, anyway, I don't own a Tesla, so I am safe for a while from that.
No one's wiping their ass on your Tesla.
So crazy.
It's amazing. We'll talk about it today, but we'll go down specifically through all the just horrible trends we've had over the last 10 years with solid economic data. It's not something made up, and not one outrage about it. No pitchforks for anything. And all of a sudden, the situation we're in now, Canadians are united. Like, where the hell were they for the last 10 years?
I gotta start checking my door handles.
That's right.
So what else is happening, Steve? Outrage and Twitter and all that stuff.
Yeah, no, it's just, we'll get into it. Like, we're gonna bring Brent on to again sort of chat sort of geopolitics and particularly what's happening in the US and how that can impact Canada. We'll get into it after the show. We want to bring on we want to chat further with Rich about Canada's CPI, because Rich, you've been all over that. A huge uptick in Canada's CPI. We've got some more election stuff. We've got consumer confidence. We've got some update on Canada's population figures. We've got some updates as well on the Canadian banks, what they're doing on the lending side as this tariff war breaks out. So some big news there. So there's definitely like a lot to cover. But before Brent gets on here, just really on the federal election stuff, just kind of ramping up. It's interesting. Did you guys see that? So obviously Carney is now your PM, and they were Rosemary Barton, who's the CBC news anchor. I don't know if you guys saw that. So Rosemary, basically, she broke the party line. She sort of weaved her own course there and asked Carney about his blind trust, which apparently is just you're not supposed to do.
Mm-hmm.
And
you mean you're not supposed to ask? You are supposed to have one, but you're not supposed to ask about that stuff.
Right. Well, he's the anointed one, right? So you can't start making him look bad. And so he was, sort of squirming up there on stage. And Rich, what did he say? You have to look inside yourself.
Which was the most arrogant thing I've ever heard a politician say, and that's saying a lot. But he told her to look inside herself, which I thought was quite interesting as far as a comment. But yeah.
Well, how would you do that? Is it a mirror, or do you stick your head up your ass? Like, how do you do it?
There's a dirty joke in there somewhere, but I'll stay as far away as possible from that.
Well, the best part about it was like, so the left on Twitter, everyone was like trending. They were demanding that Rosemary Barton be fired from the CBC, that she be basically punished, banned. I was like, this lady has been a staunch CBC journalist. I think we know which way that they tend to sort of gravitate, and she sort of she veered off by accident, and all of a sudden everyone's turned on her. So they're
which
trying
is
to cancel
totally
Rose.
unfair, by the way. And
Yeah.
and to credit to her, she hit back. She's like, oh, all of a sudden, all these conservatives are defending me.
Yeah.
Which I thought, and people deserve that as well, because all they do is give her shit. And the one time that she asks like a tough question, they're now pumping her tires. Well, anyway, I just thought.
So I mean, that's just
but for a not just a politician, but even and someone who's at a press conference or hosting it, let alone the the prime minister of our country, to respond to a reporter that way for a legitimate question. There was nothing wrong with the question at all. It just tells me Loonie Hour is going to have some pretty good material coming up there, lads. The next 5 weeks are going to be pretty exciting.
I think the takeaway there, though, is just so many people out there that just don't want to hear like an opposing view, or if you start asking hard questions, I mean, Rich, we saw it obviously during the pandemic. You're dubbed like the conspiracy theorist, and you're not going. So yeah, I mean, the cancel culture is still alive and well, and Rosemary, who's been again a sort of a staunch supporter of the left, is suddenly in their crosshairs, which I found kind of ironic and unjust. But we'll see. Well, it'll be interesting as things progress here. So Sunday, expect Mark Carney to announce the upcoming election, and the polls right now are neck and neck. So,
really? I thought I saw a Liberal Party with the majority now, which is,
I mean,
depends.
Well, some of that is skewed with that Ecos poll of that Frank guy who everyone's kind of suspicious of. But I think regardless of which poll, there's a lot of volatility in the polls. But I think what you can say is, as of right now, assuming the polls are accurate, it's going to be a close race.
Yeah.
But I mean, people don't know how, elections are run and everything. Get your circle or your compass and go right around the Ontario, GTA, Southern Ontario area. Because, where I'm in Commie Land, this place is done. We don't even need to campaign down here. Out west,
don't bother.
most of the ridings are already established out there as well. I'm assuming Saskatchewan is set too.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm assuming it's basically just like it comes down to essentially Ontario and how they want to vote.
And Quebec.
Yeah. Okay.
And Quebec, just all we need to hear is Quebec will decide once the French language debate is had. So that's still up for grabs, I would say. But yeah, it's basically Ontario. Anyway.
So this is an open invitation, by the way. Anyone that is listening to this of a political party. So if you're Jagmeet or you're Mark Carney or you're Pierre Poilievre, the invite is open on the Loonie Hour. We are happy to have any one of you on the show in the coming weeks to discuss your platform, and we'll be as objective, as nonpartisan as possible. So that is an open invite. If any of their comms teams are listening to this, which we know some of them are, the invite is open. So you can send us a note on the Loonie Hour website, and we will coordinate something for you. But
cool.
Without further ado, we have an interview coming up with Brent Johnson. So let's jump to that right now.
Brent, this is your second time, I believe, on the podcast.
I think so. That sounds right.
And we had, don't want to hear this, we have had another guest on 3 times. Who was our 3-timer? Rick? Steve?
I don't remember.
We had someone on 3 times.
No, it was...
No, Luke didn't make it. He's not on the roster. Anyway, Brent, you are catching up. So everyone today, Brent's a dear friend of the podcast. We've known Brent for a long time. And Brent is a money manager. So when he shares his view on something, he actually has skin in the game. So it's not like his thoughts on something. So Brent is the founder of Santiago Capital. He manages wealth for high net worth families around the world, and he's having a lot of success with that. Brent is also known for developing, here it comes, Brent, the dollar milkshake theory. And that's with you. But again, it just explains so much what's happening around the world. And recently, Brent he's founded and he's the co-host of the Alchemist, newsletter.
Macroeconomics, yep.
There we go. It's a research platform. Everyone should check that out if they can. And he also hosts his own podcast as well. And I think it's Milkshakes, Markets, and Madness. Did I get that right as
You
well?
got it. You got
And
it.
the last thing you guys don't know about Brent, he's pretty modest as well in some things. But Brent was a pretty good basketball player back in his day. March Madness has started. But Brent actually played for Hickory High School when they won state. And then he went on and he had a lot of success with University of Kansas as well, I think it was.
I would say I had some minor success with the University of Kansas. I was on their JV team the year they went to the Final Four. So I don't have the ring, but I was somewhat involved.
If anyone can dig it up on Brent's Twitter feed, he wrote an amazing memory of his experience, though, playing basketball there. And to this day, I still remember reading that. That's a real good story.
You know what? I'm going to retweet that today. In honor of March Madness, I'm going to retweet that today.
Okay, who's your pick then? Who's your final? Who's the winner of the March Madness?
St. John's. I got St. John's winning it.
Okay, I have Texas Tech for some reason, but on
Sorry,
we
is this
go.
basketball?
Yeah, these guys are Canadians, so they're
What about the
still-
Habs?
Yeah, they still follow that. But Steve, why don't you lead us into the conversation with Brent? Because we have so many things happening up here, and we're excited to hear your view on stuff.
Yeah, Brent. I mean, obviously, Canada-U.S. relations, Canadians are in a tiffy. One thing we try to do with this podcast is try to look at the world as objectively as possible. That's why we kind of want to bring you on the show today, because I think what happens is a lot of Canadians is today, especially, is they're failing to sort of look at the economics of it, and they're just basically they're just enraged, and I think not necessarily looking at policies from different perspectives. They're unwilling to sort of open up their mind. So what do you think is really going on with this Canada-US tariff war? There's been a lot of discussions. Is it really fentanyl? Is it Trump's got this master plan to, have this external revenue service through tariffs? Obviously, the geopolitics are shifting around the world. Maybe the U.S. doesn't want to necessarily be pay for the defense of all these countries. What in your opinion is sort of behind all of this?
Well, I do think there is a master plan, but I should probably preface this by saying I don't think this is a 3D chess move that Trump is secretly trying to deploy. Like, I think he's pretty open about it, right? He's literally telling everybody exactly what he wants to do. And that's kind of what is upsetting everybody. The fact that it isn't a secret hidden agenda is, I think, causing as much problem as if he were to secretly trying to be doing something. So with regard to the United States and Canada, I think largely what he is doing is, I think he actually wants really, really good relationship with Canada. And I think he is trying in his way to point out why it can be better than it currently is. And I think he is also trying to get Canada to do to China what he wants to do to China. In other words, this is such a big topic. It's kind of hard to figure out where exactly to come at it. But I think everybody is aware that, let's just call it, over the last 5 or 10 years, especially since COVID, the world has shifted. We've gone from a globalizing world to a deglobalizing world. And everything has kind of changed. And, the United States is the sole superpower, but there are other powers. Russia's a great power. China's a great power. And in this great game, the United States wants to stay on top amidst a shifting world. And I think to do that, Trump believes he needs to bring jobs back to the United States. And I think he knows that that is going to be a very tough process. And so in order to do that, he has to do some other things as well. And one of the things is try to contain China and try to outcompete China. And one of the ways they do that is they get the United States allies to agree to an overall strategy of containment of China, while at the same time enhancing the Western Hemisphere. And my personal opinion on this is that Canada is coming at this wrong. And I would say perhaps Trump is coming at it wrong as well. But if you actually listen to what he's saying, it actually makes a lot of sense. The United States, Canada, and Mexico are an incredibly powerful force. if united and more integrated than they are now, there's no other part of the world that can even come close to touching them, in my opinion. And I think Trump recognizes that. And I think just because of who he is going to try to get that either one way or the other. Right? And I think ultimately that will happen one way or the other. I think there will be greater integration between the United States and Canada and Mexico. And I think he would like to do it nicely, but if that's not possible, I think he's happy to do it the other way. And this is probably at the point in the story I should probably say, this is not necessarily the way I want things to go. It's just the way that I think they are going to go, right? And when you look at a map of the world, the United States as the hegemon is not going to let Canada go to one of its competitors, right? The United States is not going to let one of its competitors control the Panama Canal. The United States is not going to let Greenland be controlled by one of its competitors. It's just not going to happen without a great conflict, along the way. And so I believe that when I said Canada's coming at this the wrong way, I think they're trying to out-Trump Trump. And I think that's the wrong way to deal with Trump. I think one of the reasons that Trump is kind of hated, for lack of a better way of saying it, is because of the way he says things and the way he comes across as arrogant or pushy or however you want to describe that. But if you actually listen to what he's saying rather than how he's saying it, it makes a lot of sense, right? And if I was Canada, when he started saying these things, rather than getting upset and arguing back, I would have just laughed and said, oh, Trump, he's so crazy. But you know what? We love him. We love the United States. It's one of our greatest allies. We're going to do great business together. And we look forward to working with Trump. If the Canadian politicians would have said that and just kind of laughed off the whole 51st state thing, it probably would have died. And the trade deal would probably already be done. And we would all be happy. And so I kind of find it funny that when people say they don't like the way Trump says things, but they'll turn around and call him a Nazi or say he's mean or he's crude. So rather than being different and acting the way they would want Trump to act, they end up acting like Trump, which I think just makes the whole situation worse. So that's I know I kind of rambled on for a little bit there, but that's kind of how I see kind of the big picture with Canada and the United States.
Well, Keith, I know you're itching to jump in there, so go ahead.
So Brent, first of all, if you were up here, you would be as same as with Rich now. You would be called a Trumper. You can't act like that.
I know.
And you've also insulted all of Canada as well by saying they're actually acting like Trump, because in their mind up here, they're doing the opposite. Things there's a lot of emotion up here right now. And, one thing that, all of us here look at, of course, is, we know what policies should be enacted or introduced or what conversations should happen. But then you look at reality and what is actually happening. And I don't know how big this is down in the US. I know it is hitting some of the night shows and stuff like that. But, from my perspective, and Steve, Rich, maybe you guys can tell me I'm a bit wrong, but this is not dying down. This is escalating. And we're probably going to have an election here in the next 5 weeks, I think it's going to be. And it's going to get even more aggressive, towards the US and the president there. So this is going to create, some chaos and madness, for you to talk about.
I think, what I can sort of chime in here, Brent, is some Canadian context. Is basically what's happening is so obviously Canadians are all enraged about this. I am kind of curious your thoughts on if you believe he's genuinely serious about Canada being a 51st state, or if that's more just sort of his rhetoric to say, hey, listen, we should be greater trading partners. But from a politician's perspective, all the political parties are basically just becoming like the anti-Trump parties. So the more that you can distance yourself away from Trump, it seems to be the strategy from every single political party. And that's where we've seen, obviously, the conservatives have dropped off significantly in the polls over the last 2, 3, 4 weeks. Is because people are essentially aligning that party closer to Trump and saying, well, hey, if he gets in, maybe he's closer, he's buddies, and he's going to sort of cave to the US. So now, that's sort of what's happening in the political space, is just everyone is just so anti-Trump here. He is probably the most hated man in Canada. And I think people are almost drifting away and ignoring the economic policies and just strictly focusing on how are we going to deal with this guy.
Well, let me ask you a question related to that, because I'm really curious to your take on this. And when you say everybody in Canada, do you mean everybody in Eastern Canada, or do you mean everybody in Canada? And the reason I ask that is I was at a dinner in Vancouver in 2020, right before COVID broke out. And there was a lot of very well-known, very kind of high-profile, very successful Canadian businessmen at this dinner. There's about 12 people there. And I am not joking when I say that, to a man, they all spoke about Western Canada. And they were the topic came up that they were very clear that they did not mean Canada, that they meant Western Canada. And I don't know how to characterize it anything other than they did not feel like the East had their best interests at heart.
It doesn't.
And so I'm curious whether what's going on now with the United States and Canada, whether you guys hear any of that stuff, or whether you interact with any of those people, and whether that feeling has been magnified since then, or because kind of the whole national sovereignty has been threatened, so to speak, have those who were very clearly speaking about Western Canada, have they become more inclined to go with Eastern Canada, whereas 5 years ago they hated Eastern? I mean, really don't know how else to say it. I mean, it was a very vocal, very emotional opposition to Eastern Canada.
Yeah, Rich,
So
I don't know.
can I just jump in there? So I think that, first of all, I think it's worth noting that has been true for 150 years, right?
Sure.
And it flared up in the 70s. And so I think that context is important. So there's always been sort of this idea that, we milk this the East milks this cow and, doesn't give it its flowers. I'm not sure that'll ever change, really, until they redistrict the MPs in Ottawa to better reflect the population growth and the money basically that's out west. But I think both things can be true sort of at the same time, which is there is that schism that exists, and over the last couple of years that's sort of been exacerbated because Ottawa is dead set on destroying the oil and gas sector in Canada. But at the same time, Canadians would I think in the West, and Steve will correct me if I'm wrong, sort of pinch their nose and say, well, we'd rather be Canadian, but only just, you know what I mean? So I think that there's, I know it's sort of maybe a cop out, but I think both sort of answers are right, even though they're kind of against one another.
Well, I mean, here's part of the reason that I think the Canadian leadership has come at this the wrong way. It's totally fine and totally expected and acceptable to be patriotic and to love your country and to want to protect its national sovereignty. I mean, to say anything else, you would probably get fired from your leadership position, right? But at the same time, do you really want to antagonize the global superpower? Do you really want to be at war with the United States? And we can say that, figuratively or literally. Unfortunately, this thing has accelerated so quickly that, you see these things now where France sent its, nuclear submarine to Newfoundland or something like that. And I don't think it was because they were trying to threaten the United States, but some people took it as that, right? And things can get out of control pretty quickly, I guess. And so my whole thing on this has always been try to be as pragmatic as possible. And you got to understand, I'm somebody who doesn't even think countries should exist, let alone governments running those countries. And as a result, I certainly don't think empires should exist. But the real world has countries and it has empires. And I think this is, the empire, flexing its muscles and trying to get its will or its way one way or the other. And I don't think, in my opinion, that Canada is in a place to really fight against it. Now, you can fight against it, but you don't want to ratchet that higher. If anything, you'd want to kind of cool that down, in my opinion. And I think a lot of people's ego and pride is getting involved here.
So Brent, there's one
when
more
it shouldn't
little
be.
piece. Sorry to interrupt you, but there's one more tiny piece of context, and I'm really interested in the rest of your views, so I'll be quiet.
Yep.
But the Liberals were like getting crushed in the polls. We were talking about like high single digits. And right or wrong, one thing sort of most people, Canadians agree with is that everybody hates Trump. Again, whatever.
Yep.
And so to me, in my personal view, and maybe people disagree, but it was like a gift from the heavens that Trump came over the top, because it allowed a repositioning of the Liberal Party from 10 years of having literally the second worst GDP per capita in the OECD to we're the only people to stand up to Trump. And that, I think, cannot be like excluded from the analysis when we consider the reaction.
Well, I'll tell you from an outsider, it's interesting to hear you say, because that's exactly how I saw it as an outsider. My outsider's view was that Polyev was making inroads and rising in the polls, and the Liberal Party was kind of on the downward trajectory, to be polite. And it just totally switched like overnight. And I actually feel like Polyev is in a really, really tough spot politically, because if he were to say anything pro-Trump, he's going to get crushed. And if he were to say anything anti-Canada, pro-United States, he's going to get crushed. But at the same time, God, it was just a couple of months ago, like he was the rising star, like he was the heir apparent, sort of. And so it's just from a pure political perspective, it's kind of fascinating to watch.
What do you think, Brent, in terms of then ultimately, like, what does Trump want out of this? So does he want more oil and gas from the Canadian energy sector? What does he want? I mean, does he actually want Canada to be the 51st state, and what that looks like?
So, yeah. So I think there's two things. So first of all, this isn't me saying this. This is Trump himself saying this, is he thinks he's the greatest president in history. And he wants everybody else to think that he's the greatest president in history. And he wants to usher in this new golden era for the United States. And you cannot be considered the greatest president in history of the United States if Canada takes over your superpower role, right? Those two things are kind of mutually exclusive. And so I think he very much wants to limit China's rise to power. But I also think he wants to do it in a peaceful way. I don't think Trump wants war. I don't think he's against having it if it requires it, but I don't think that's his preference. He envisions himself as this businessman who does these incredible deals. And that's what he wants to do. So I think he wants to contain China's rise, and he wants to elevate the United States. So how do you do that? Well, if you are the president that oversees the integration of Canada into the United States, how do you not go down in history as a great person in history, right? Same with Mexico. Now, I'm not saying he necessarily wants them to be part of the United States, but I certainly think he would love it, right? And he would not be opposed to it. But even if he doesn't get them as a state, I think he wants to make the Western Hemisphere, kind of, I call it Fortress America, from the North Pole to the South Pole. He wants it kind of like the Monroe Doctrine. He wants the United States to be totally involved in everything in the Western Hemisphere, and it to be, very integrated and, kind of us against the world type of a thing. And so, but you can't do that without Canada and Mexico. And so I do think he is serious, but I don't think he wants to go to war with Canada. I don't think he wants to hurt Canada. And I think he truly believes that Canada being part of the United States would be to Canada's economic interest. I know Canadians don't agree with that, but if I just look at it, I think if Trump were to say, I'm just going to do reciprocal tariffs, or I will drop all our tariffs to zero if you will drop all your tariffs to zero. So in other words, let's just make it even Steven across the board. Forget becoming a state. Let's just remove all of the barriers and let's be fully integrated. I think I think that would be great. But I don't think Canada would accept that. That's the thing, is I think Trump is actually I got to be careful how I say this because I know how it's going to be interpreted, but I think he's actually being kind of fair. He's saying it's just going to be reciprocal. If people have tariffs on us, we're going to put tariffs on them. If you want to drop tariffs to zero, we'll drop tariffs to zero. I have a hard time understanding how that's a bad argument, how that's a bad deal, or how he's being unfair if he's agreeing, even though he says it in a mean way, to do whatever the other country's doing. And I think if that were to happen, and I do think this will happen. I think ultimately this will all be smoothed over. I think Canada and the United States will be more integrated, and I think it'll be better for everybody. But I think it's going to be a really tough process to get there because, we are the number one export market for Canada. Most of your oil and gas reserves, which are the big part of your revenue, if not the biggest part of your revenue, it's all designed to be shipped to the United States. There's been talk about how they're just going to start shipping it to the Europe instead of the United States. Well, first of all, your infrastructure makes that very difficult, right? You would have to build new infrastructure or at least enhance the existing infrastructure to do that in a major way. And then second of all, do you really think Trump would just sit by and let that happen?
Brent, it's not a thing. It's not a thing. Anyone who understands anything about the energy infrastructure in North America knows that that's just totally bullshit.
Yeah.
Let's
and that's why I think ultimately it will get figured out because it has to, right? Because there really is no other option.
Did you know that your personal data is being bought and sold online without your consent? Your name, location history, even your login credentials are out there, waiting to be used by advertisers, scammers, or worse. And with data breaches rising by 68% in just 1 year, the risk is only growing. Data brokers are collecting and selling your private information right now, and once your data is out there, it's nearly impossible to get it back unless you have Incogni. Incogni does the hard work for you. They contact data brokers on your behalf, demand removal of your personal info, and even follow up to keep it off the market for good. Take back control of your privacy in just 3 easy steps. Sign up and let Incogni know what data you want removed, grant them permission to work on your behalf, and sit back while they handle the rest. Try Incogni risk-free for 30 days. If you're not satisfied, you'll get a full refund, no questions asked. Protect yourself today at incogni.com/Loonie Hour. That's incogni.com/Loonie Hour. Incogni, because your data should belong to you and no one else.
but not for another 5 weeks. We have to go through this.
Well, yeah, I mean, obviously, again, from the Canadians' perspective, they're going to push back. We've probably lost half the audience already, but hey, Trump drafted USMCA when he was last in power there. So, he's complaining about a deal that he initiated. And so again, I'm just playing devil's advocate here, but that's the argument that we're hearing obviously in Canada.
Well, listen, I think there's some truth to that. I mean, I'm not against saying that Trump is hypocritical in some things, right? But, I think you also have to understand, like, the world has changed. Really, like, post-COVID, the world has changed. And, things are happening now that, there's, I can't remember how exactly that saying goes, but there's years go by where nothing happens, and then there's days go by where years happen or decades happen. And I kind of feel like that's the environment that we're in, whether it's the Middle East, whether it's Asia, whether it's North America. I mean, it's really incredible, the potential outcomes that are on the table right now.
Brent, I'm kind of curious, again, your thoughts from an outsider's perspective, but, if you look at a guy like Mark Carney, who's now the PM, one of the first trips that he made as soon as he became prime minister is he's traveling all over Europe, trying to sort of renegotiate or put together new deals with, the Eurozone. And so I guess I'm kind of curious, let's just assume that he, stays the prime minister. He is sort of the sort of globalist elite. He's been heavily involved in the Eurozone in his past history. Do you see him sort of gravitating more towards Europe, further away from the US? And what does that do to that relationship?
Well, it's a really interesting dynamic because, Canada is part of the Commonwealth, right? And England is not in the EU, right? So, and I don't think England wants to go back to being part of the EU. And despite all the, the rhetoric, I think the quote unquote special relationship between the United States and the UK is going to remain that way. And so I think it would be really difficult for Canada to align with the EU against the United States and against England. So to me, a lot of what they're doing is listen, these politicians have to do this, or else, in order to reinvigorate Canadian pride and stuff. So I understand why they're doing it, but this is going to sound very arrogant, but I'm going to say it anyway. Like if Canadians think that sidling up to the King of England and France is going to somehow scare the United States, you're just totally ignorant of history, right? I mean, let's be honest, right? And so, and that's kind of how I try to come at this, is take my own personal feelings out of it. I love Canada. I've been to Canada several times. I've driven all the way from, Calgary to Fairbanks, Alaska, and it's an absolutely incredible place. The people are the nicest in the world, sans Keith Dicker. But, it's just, I'm just kidding, Keith. Keith literally is the nicest person in the world. It's not just because he's Canadian. But, when you step back and you look at the globe and you understand what is happening and that things are moving very quickly, there is just no way that the United States is going to let Canada align with a competitor. I don't like saying that, but it's just not reality. And I think, and that's what I try to deal with. I try to deal with reality.
Let's move next. It's interesting. You say reality, and obviously we're having this discussion about geopolitics basically, but let's shift next then back to the global economy and financial markets, because before this whole tariff war began or started to escalate, there was clear evidence that a lot of economies around the world were either slowing, the growth was slowing, some were been in a recession, and depending on how you measure it and so forth. And now people are starting to look at the tariff war, and it hasn't hit Europe yet, but Europe is coming. Europe has a big bullseye on it, which we haven't even talked about. So it's important for Canadians to appreciate that as well. But Brent, let's talk next about what you see is happening from an economic perspective and how that could drive either capital flows around the world or monetary policy, because there is a lot of maybe disjointed policy moves taking place right now. For example, the Fed yesterday was really interesting what they did. And so why don't you just share your thoughts on that, and so Canadians can understand what's happening outside of Canada.
Yeah, sure. Well, first thing I would say is I think it's pretty interesting that it wasn't very long ago, a year ago, 18 months ago, where people said rates will never come down again. Inflation is out of control. The world will never get inflation under control again, and rates will have to stay high. And since then, rates have started to come down. And central banks around the world are cutting rates or talking dovishly. And I think that's a big change. And the Fed has made progress getting inflation down. Perhaps it's not as low as they want it to go, but they're even talking about, slowing down and doing more rate cuts and being more, quote unquote, accommodative to markets. And so, to me, it's amazing, to see how fast the pendulum can swing in the other direction. As far as what's really interesting to me right now is the capital. So for the last 2 or 3 years, capital's been flooding into the United States, a la the milkshake. And that was kind of my thesis, was that the dollar would stay strong versus other currencies. It would push U.S. equities higher, it would push gold higher, probably real estate would rise. And we've seen that in a big way. Now, the last 2 or 3 months, though, or especially in the last 6 to 8 weeks, capital has started, quote unquote, leaving the United States, and it's been going to Europe mainly. And part of the reason it's been going to Europe is Trump, right? It's crazy how one guy can influence so many things. But he has basically told Europe that they're going to have to protect themselves, and they're going to have to pay for their own protection. And the United States will protect them, but they're going to have to pay for it, right? And they're going to have to help fund it. And it's no longer solely going to be on the United States' dime. And as a result, the bond yields in France and Germany and Italy and Spain, they've spiked. I don't know if anybody has looked. One of the big arguments against the potential success of the United States has been interest rates have spiked. There's no way the United States will be able to pay for all this debt and service this debt and raise new debt going forward with these high interest rates. Well, my God, take a look and see what's happened to European rates in the last 6 weeks. I mean, they've gone vertical. And so how is Germany going to pay for all this? How is France going to pay for all this? How is Spain going to pay for all this? Well, the ECB is, but the ECB is going to have to print more money, going to have to print more euros, right? But despite that's what's eventually going to have to happen in the short period of time, those higher yields have been pulling capital from the United States back into Europe. And that has made the euro stronger and has made the US dollar weaker. Now, that may continue for another month or two. I don't think it will continue for 2 or 3 years. But I think ultimately, when we get into a crisis, the whole world still needs dollars to operate. And, you know, if they don't have dollars, they cannot service all their US dollar obligations. And that ends up being dollar positive. So I don't know what's going to happen over the next 2 or 3 weeks. I'm still very confident what happens over the next 2 or 3 years. I think the United States will still outperform global markets on the longer term basis. And somewhat related to this, we should probably talk about it. I mean, this is a very good example. You know, at the same time that Canada is talking about, you know, disassociating with the United States and more integration with, you know, England or Europe, they issue a US dollar bond, right? We're going to de-dollarize and we're no longer going to do business with the United States, but we're also going to borrow in dollars. Well, the reason they're borrowing in dollars is they have a lot of US dollar obligations. They need dollars to fund the debt that they already have and the obligations that they already have. And they know that to operate on the global stage, they need dollars. And with this tiff going on with the United States, I think that what they're doing is they're getting dollars as quickly as they can to try to wait out whatever negotiations are going on with the United States. I mean, ultimately, I think this ends up really bad for Canada. You're borrowing in a currency that you cannot print. And so they're ultimately probably going to have to print even more Canadian dollars to then exchange for US dollars to be able to service that US dollar debt. And I don't think that that is good for the Canadian dollar long term.
I mean, to be fair, Brent, it is a very, very small amount of money.
Yeah, it is. It is. But it absolutely is. But to me, it's more symbolic than anything, right?
I hear you. I hear you.
Yeah.
But it is a very small amount of money.
It is a very small amount. Yeah.
So with that, we have this situation. The economy is slowing around the world. We know anyway, and I think a lot of our listeners appreciate it as well, that you do need US dollars to operate. But Brent, why don't you just share with everyone what the difference is between, there's really two kinds of US dollars in the world. There's domestic dollars and then the Eurodollar market. We talk about that every now and then, but maybe you can just share a little bit about that. So I think then our audience would better appreciate, because when you say, hey, people need US dollars to, to fund their balance sheet, global trade and everything. And we talk about that all the time. If people know what letters of credit are, they will appreciate this as well. But just talk a little bit about the Eurodollar market versus the US dollar domestic market. And then we'll jump back then into potential monetary policy decisions that we did have at the Fed yesterday. So I know Rich has a few thoughts on it as well, and so does Steve, with where rates are going.
Sure. Okay. So I'll explain the Eurodollar market, but in order to accurately explain the Eurodollar market, I got to give the audience a little bit of history. And some people may already know this, but some people may not. So I'll try to go through this quickly, but it is really important. So after World War II, we had the Bretton Woods Agreement where the United States dollar was tied to gold, and then a number of global currencies were tied to the dollar at fixed exchange rates. Fast forward 20 years, and now the United States has been involved in the Korean War. They're bogged down in the Vietnam War. They're instituting new social programs and policies, and they're spending a lot of money. And as a result, countries, specifically France, starts to question, the value of the U.S. dollar and U.S. treasuries, and they start, turning their dollars in exchange for the gold, because that was the deal back then. It was exchangeable for gold. Fast forward a couple more years, and then Nixon doesn't want France to take any more gold away, and they don't want any of the other countries to take gold away, so they remove the convertibility of gold. So now we have a period of about a year where it's just purely free floating exchange rates. And there was a lot of angst at the time. Does that mean the US dollar is going to lose its global reserve currency status? But what happened about a year later was the agreement between the United States and Saudi Arabia to price oil in dollars. And because the whole world needed to buy Saudi Arabian oil to fund their economies, everybody needed dollars to buy that oil or that energy. And that kind of spearheaded, well, I should back up. And even back during the 50s and the 60s, especially during the reconstruction in Europe. And as the United States was becoming the global economy, or the biggest global economy, countries and businesses around the world would start conducting business in US dollar because it was the most common currency other than their local currencies. It was the most efficient, it was the cheapest, it was the most available. And so you had this sort of this development of this Eurodollar market. So the difference between a US dollar and a Eurodollar is just geographic location. Dollars located inside the United States are called dollars. Dollars or dollar-based credit or dollar-based loans outside the United States are called Eurodollars. Well, after the oil for dollars deal or agreement, that just sent the whole Eurodollar market exponential because everybody needed dollars, everybody saved in dollars, it became even more popular to use dollars for global trade. Think of it like a language. If you have somebody from Spain goes to Qatar, what language do each of them probably speak? Probably English. So that's what they conduct their speaking in. And that's how dollars ended up working on the global stage. Dollars became the global language upon which international business was conducted. And the United States didn't even have to be involved. It could be a shoe manufacturer in Turkey selling things to Morocco. It could be a rubber manufacturer in the Philippines being a supplier to Japan. And that trade was conducted in US dollar-based credit. And that really went exponential, after this oil for dollars deal. And so now the market for dollars outside the United States dwarfs the market for dollars inside the United States. It's orders of magnitude larger than inside the United States. So people know that the United States owes like $36 trillion. Not as many people know that the rest of the world owes $36 trillion or more, actually a lot more. And they don't owe it to the United States, they owe it to each other. And it's based in dollars. But there's only 3 ways they can get those dollars. 1, they can trade with the United States, they can send the United States goods, and the United States sends them dollars in return. That's one way they can get it. The third way they can get it is the US can extend a swap line to their central bank. So the central bank can borrow dollars from the United States, and then the central bank can loan it out into those countries. And the third way they can get it is they can risk their own balance sheet and they can loan new dollars into existence or dollar-based credit into existence. And that's fine as long as the market is expanding and growth is happening and credit is circulating. The problem comes when you get into a slowdown or, God forbid, a credit contraction, and there is no entity outside the United States that can inject new base money to stop that credit contraction from happening. That is where, I'll just use the Canadian bond example again, just because it's relevant here. To Richard's point, it's a very small amount, but in that scenario where dollars start disappearing in a global slowdown, but you still owe that US dollar debt, you could see the Canadian dollar fall versus the US dollar. And so if there's $1 million US dollar loan that you took out, but now all of a sudden the Canadian dollar falls 15% versus the US dollar, it's like owing $1.15 million. So, it's basically a carry trade gone wrong, or a carry trade that blows up. And the reason this is important, and this is why I always say the DXY index or the Asian dollar index or the broad dollar index, even though it is just one fiat versus another fiat, and even though all fiat gets debased over time, every financial crisis of the last 50 or 60 years had either some component that was either a cause or exacerbated that crisis was one fiat currency rising rapidly versus another that country could not print. And more often than not, and that is why you always see the US dollar rise whenever there's a global crisis or whether there's a global slowdown. It's just based on the design of the system. And then so that's why it becomes really, really important. And that's part of the reason why so many countries around the world are so upset about these tariffs that Trump is proposing. Because what Trump is proposing will mean fewer dollars being sent from the United States out into the rest of the world, which means the rest of the world is going to have to source those dollars on their own by borrowing more US dollar credit, because it won't be coming from the United States. And that just causes all kinds of problems. That is why we're seeing a slowdown in growth prospects. That is why we're seeing, asset prices start to roll over. It's all related. And, people ask me why I talk about the dollar so much. And the reason I talk about the dollar so much is because it literally affects everything that has to do with my job. Like every security in the world is priced off of the US dollar. Every single one. It's just the way the system is designed. And so it's extremely important.
So this is the kind of stuff that I enjoy listening to even before I go to bed and things. I find it incredibly exciting.
Me too.
And and Rich, come on, Steve, you would
No,
say it too.
I'm just listening here. I'm enjoying the conversation.
But for our audience, mostly our audience is all Canadian, and we're always focused on Canadian specific events, no matter what part of the market or how it's touching us. But I always bring this conversation back to everyone because, for example, Brent, you suggested earlier, or you told us earlier, we really, if you look at the 10-year over in Germany and France and Italy and Spain, I think they've gone up 40 to 80 basis points probably on the 10-year in a very short time frame. Now, the probability of one of these countries, including Canada or over in Asia as well, experiencing some kind of funding crisis, it just creates the opportunity for it to escalate very, very quickly. And so right now, I think everyone would agree with financial markets over the last 6 weeks. It has not been a crisis moment at all. It's some excesses have been removed from some parts of the market, but the opportunity is there. We can hit that slippery slope. And if it does, we're all going to remember when Brent, shared with us how the dollar system works, because that's incredibly important. So in Canada, keep thinking, wake up in the morning, view Europe and Asia and so forth, because you might think maybe, Trump has caused the Canadian dollar to decline rapidly. Maybe he contributed to it in some nuance, but it's really the funding markets and the access to credit and dollar specifically. Would you guys want to give Brent one more question?
Can I give you an example that's somewhat related to that? And I think that people will remember. So I believe today, I might be off by a day, but I think today is the 5-year anniversary of the COVID low. I think the low came in on the morning of March 20th, 2020. But let's fast forward back, or let's rewind back to a month before that, or 3 weeks before that. At the end of February, COVID started to kind of percolate kind of late January. It picked up speed a little bit in the middle of February. And by the end of February, markets had started to sell off. And I believe, and the DXY was starting to rise. And so I think the DXY index, the dollar index, was around 98. Let's just call it the last week of February, last day of February, first day of March. And so the Fed came out on a weekend during, a non-scheduled meeting and did a rate cut as in order to get things under control. And the markets thought that was great. The Fed's here. They're going to weaken the dollar and everything's going to be fine. And so over the next 9 days, the dollar index went from 98 to 94. And then 9 days after that, the DXY was at 103 and the world was on its knees. So it went from 98 to 94 to 103 in the space of 3 weeks. That's pretty damn fast. And if you didn't understand the dynamics, you wouldn't understand what was happening. But that's how fast it can happen. And the reason it can happen that fast is the whole world is short dollars. What I mean by that is they have borrowed dollars or extended US dollars. And that was a global margin call on the US dollar. And that's why asset prices fell, because people were selling assets in order to get US dollar. And that's how quickly it can happen. In the middle of February, everything was fine. And by the middle of March, the world was on its knees. And so, even though things may look, and think about what we've had for the last 2 or 3 weeks. We've had markets go down, but they haven't collapsed. The point is these things can accelerate really, really quickly. And you kind of need to be prepared ahead of time, because you probably won't be able to figure it out in the heat of the battle.
Brent, how are you looking at the Fed these days? Obviously, it came out yesterday.
Yeah, I actually think again, I got to be careful how I say this because people misinterpret my point. I think the people that are critical of the Fed are generally people who think that the Fed should not exist in the first place, right?
Here,
But if you
here.
do, right, and listen, I'm very sympathetic to that view, and so from that lens, any move that they do should be viewed negatively because they shouldn't exist in the first place. But if you do think that central banks should exist and you do understand what they're trying to do, they've actually done a pretty good job. You know, they were able to get inflation from high single digits down to low single digits over a 12 to 18 month period without crashing the economy into a global depression, which many thought would be necessary to do it. And I think they're still trying to do that. Now they have another challenge on their hands. They're trying to keep, you know, the United States economy in a good spot, despite the new president trying to completely change the global world order, right? And you got to understand what Trump is doing is not a small change. He is literally changing global alliances, global treaties. He's changing the way the United States fundamentally does business. And it's even under the best of circumstances, that was going to be a volatile process. And I think we can all agree that this is not necessarily the best of circumstances right now. So I think overall the Fed is doing what I would expect them to do based on their mandate. I do think that 2025 is going to be very similar to 2022. If you remember 2022, the first 6 to 9 months were characterized by very aggressive rate hikes in order to combat inflation. And because nobody knew how far they were going to go, how fast they were going to go, what the terminal rate was going to be, and how it was all going to affect the market, all of that uncertainty led to great volatility and downward sloping asset prices for the first 6 to 9 months. Because it was a whole new ballgame. People had never seen an aggressive rate hiking cycle before. And that's kind of what we have now. Nobody alive today has seen the United States trying to put tariffs on the way that they're trying to put on now. There's a lot of uncertainty around it. And in some ways, tariffs have the same effect on the global market as interest rate hikes. Interest rate hikes would theoretically reduce the flow of dollars to the rest of the world, and that's what tariffs would do. And as a result, I think there's a lot of uncertainty, and there's going to be a lot of uncertainty for the first 6 to 9 months. And so I would expect, while there's going to be vicious rallies along the way, you know, the biggest individual daily rallies always come during, you know, down markets or in bear markets. I do expect there to be volatility for the first 6 to 9 months as we get more clarity on how this whole trade war works out. But I actually think that once we get past that, maybe things won't be as bad as many people expect. Maybe the United States, Canada, and Mexico will make up and we'll have this grand bargain, you know, in the next few months. And, you know, everything will be fine. And so I'm cautiously optimistic. I think there's going to be great volatility for the next 6 months, but after that, I'm kind of cautiously optimistic.
So Brent, can I just jump in there? And so my question is about that volatility. And I think a lot of people I'm obsessed as I get older. I'm like more and more obsessed with history and reading history. And I just finished Richard Nixon's biography. And, you know, I'm reminded of years like 1953, you know, the Iranian coup d'etat, you know, you mentioned 1944, there's 1968, you know, we just, you know, 1973, you know, with the oil embargo, and, you know, 1990 with the, you know, the fall of the Berlin Wall, 1989, 1990. I mean, how would you rate a difficult question to ask, but how would you rate what the volatility we're seeing, the change in this quote unquote new world order is relative to sort of other ones we've seen in the past 100 and 150 years? I mean, are people sort of over-indexing to the short term, or am I just too sanguine on the risks that there are to democracies, risk assets, the dollar, etc.?
Well, I think in general, people are way too heavy risk and are not as focused on the potential downsides as they should be. Now it's maybe that's changed a little bit in the last couple of weeks as asset prices have softened a bit. But in general, for much of the last 2 or 3 years, the volatility index has bounced around between 15 and 20 with occasional 1 or 2 day spikes towards 30, and then it immediately comes back down. What I found interesting over the last 4 to 6 weeks is there was a period of time where the volatility it just kept going up and up and up and up. And it didn't spike. It just very steadily went from like 15 to 30, right? And now that it's pulled back, it's still above 20. And so we didn't have a one-day spike to 30 and then back down to 15. So far this year, volatility has been elevated. Now, I still wouldn't say it's been necessarily high, but it's higher than it was for much of last year. And I kind of expect that to happen. And I think until we get further in to Trump's presidency and we actually start to see some data based on his policies being in place, this is going to be an extremely headline-driven market. He's going to come out and say something good, markets are going to rally. He's going to come out and say something bad, markets are going to sell off. And, I think that probably continues for at least another couple months and maybe more. Hopefully, kind of by Q3 and into Q4, we start to get a more actual view of how things are going. Maybe they won't be quite as bad as many expect. Maybe they'll be worse. I don't know. But until we actually get some hardcore data based on what he's doing, I just think it's going to be very volatile due to all the uncertainty.
I think that's a good spot to wrap it up. Keith, I don't know if you have any sort of parting words here, but
No, none at all. I think Brent's overall message is, don't live in the past, look to the future. It's going to be better.
One thing I'll say, if you don't like, and this is going to sound very complimentary to Keith, which I hesitate to do, but I'm going to do it anyway. So Keith and I actually share some clients, and we manage some money together, for a handful of investors. And I say this jokingly, but I also say it loving. Like Keith really is like one of the greatest guys I know, and I think he has a pretty good handle on both the domestic Canadian market and the global market. And the reason that he and I work together, and listen, I can work with a lot of different people. The reason that he and I work together is because we see the world very similarly. We kind of have a similar investment philosophy. And, Keith has introduced people to me and I've introduced people to Keith. And, for anybody out there who's trying to navigate this stuff, unless it's your full-time job, this is really, really hard to navigate. It's actually the hardest time. So I've been doing this for 25 years now. I cannot think of a more difficult time in my 25 years than right now. And I do this all the time, like 20 hours a day, I'm thinking about this stuff, right? Or 18 hours a day, I'm thinking about this stuff. And so if you don't have the time to do that, you need to find somebody that can help you with it. So I would point you squarely at Keith to do that. You owe me a couple of dinners for this, Keith. But
yeah, I think that's very kind of you.
But I actually do. No, but I actually really mean it. I actually really mean it.
That's very kind of you to say that, Brent. Yeah. So everyone, thanks for tuning in today. This was just another amazing conversation. And I think we will have Brent back to put him at 3 episodes.
For the three-peat.
For the three-piece. Absolutely.
All I need is the invite, guys. Happy to do it.
Thanks for coming on, Brent. We'll catch up soon.
Cool. Thanks, guys.
Yeah, Keith, that was a great interview with Brent there. Obviously, I know he's a good friend of yours, and he's certainly earned his respect in the finance world. Obviously, big on Twitter, but hopefully our audience there could kind of get through the first 10, 15 minutes. I know that a lot of people might disagree with the conversation around Trump and the tariff stuff. And again, I think Brent really tries to look at markets objectively as possible. So hopefully people were able to sort of get past their own enragement and just try to understand the new world order that we're in. And you can complain about it and bitch about what it is, but neither of us is going to change this. So we just have to understand what this means for our lives, for our portfolios, our businesses, etc. So again, hopefully that.
But it's a good dose of reality. And like one of the things that we said when we introduced Brent was that he manages money for people. So, he can't afford to have this emotional view and then have that reflected in portfolios if it's not going to work out. And I've seen
like bigger accounts on Twitter tweeting out that they sold all their U.S. equities because they're anti-Trump, and it's like
such bullshit. It's such bullshit until I see a freaking PDF statement from these turkeys who say that. I don't buy it for 1 second.
I don't know. I'm telling you, but anyways, obviously as a portfolio manager, your fiduciary duty is to earn the highest return with the lowest volatility, risk adjusted, and you got to put your politics and ideology aside, and so again, obviously that's what we're hoping to do with the show. But
So if we do get these policy changes, though, that the Americans are trying to implement, it is going to have dramatic effects on how the world works. But probably the most dramatic effect, and it's really just going to accelerate or bring forward what was going to happen anyway, is a severe slowdown in global growth. And that means there's going to be credit deterioration, and credit spreads are going to blow out. And
we're starting to see that now, right, Keith? We're starting to see credit
spreads are coming out. Spreads are they're not blowing out, but they're definitely widening. But they were at all-time lows, right? So it's a bit tough to make the call.
But what's great though is that they are starting to widen. And so reason I say that's great, I'm insensitive when it comes to the markets, is because it's reflecting what is actually happening. So that's a good, now okay, because we'll all, three of us will often say, the last decade, from 2010 to 2020 and a bit after, markets were just not allowed to reflect risk properly. And now it's all starting to happen. So again, I think we're in for an incredibly interesting experience coming up, and it's absolutely going to be uncomfortable for some people from a financial perspective. However, embrace it and take advantage of it. It's a gift, Steve. They're giving you a gift. Pick it up, run with it.
So speaking of sort of uncomfortable and collateral damage of these tariff wars. We had a big Canadian bank, BMO, that was out this week. I think this is an internal memo saying that they're making adjustments to their lending criteria for people in certain industries. So BMO is changing their debt servicing ratios for certain people, for people that are in certain industries. So they have quote limited appetite industries. So people that they're not really excited to lend credit to, aka mortgages. Those are people in the construction industry, transportation, leisure and entertainment, retail sales, banking and finance, manufacturing, farming and natural resources, wholesale trade, utilities, steel and aluminum. So steel and,
everything. What are the industry? Can we do
steel and aluminum they say steel and aluminum is being added to the existing limited appetite treatment list. And they say at least one borrower must have a minimum credit score of 750.
So I don't mean to laugh. These are real people. It's just the list was getting longer and longer. I feel like
for any applications received on or after March 19th, the new temporary measures will apply. So again, that's one bank. I'm sure there's others that are following. I mean, obviously, as a you'd have to think as a prudent risk manager, you might saying, well, do I really want to be dishing an 80% LTV mortgage to someone that's employed in the steel and aluminum industry in the midst of a tariff war? Probably not.
So whoa. So what you're saying is at the exact moment in time when our governments and media are whipping everyone into a frenzy to stand up, to the Americans, the banks, the commercial banks, the very guys that provide us credit to do everything, they're not being patriotic. Instead of giving you more money, easier access to credit, they're going to take it away.
Team Canada.
How come that's not in the paper? How come no one is like slamming those guys against the boards?
Well,
or the elbows up. I mean, give me a break. That's a bit.
Well, yeah. I mean, so this is obviously souring confidence. We know that the real estate market's certainly in the doldrums here. But if you look at the index of consumer confidence, so there's data points from the Conference Board of Canada. Canadian consumer confidence is lower than it was during the depths of the pandemic right now.
What was it 4 months ago?
It was pretty low, but it's
right.
Yeah, it peaked kind of like late 21, and it's just been kind of plummeting ever since. But like it's lower than the depths of the pandemic, so people are not confident right now. They are not feeling good, and obviously that's reflecting in the economy and certainly in real estate where people are making some of their largest purchases. Right? I mean, you go out and buy $1 million, $2 million house. I mean, if you're not confident, you're probably not making that decision. And so I found that to be an interesting data point. Coincides with the banks, of course, tightening credit on a lot of these industries.
But I didn't realize BMO had that internal memo, because it's not an external memo, of course. But you always like to see what banks are doing instead of what they're saying. Obviously we're watching, quite loan provisioning and stuff like that. But that's a pretty big statement to have that come out. And of course, as you say, they're risk managers, as everyone is in your life, whether you realize it or not. But they are prepping for something. And maybe this will turn around. I think we all know for the next 5 weeks, it's just going to be the trade war, tariff war drums, or it's going to be like, remember the Muppets? Remember the animal guy?
Yeah, love
Yeah,
him.
he's going to be going nuts. Yeah, instead of like boom, boom, he's just going to be going nuts. So I would imagine the banks are going to be clamping down for the next 4
You
or
kind of
5
look
weeks.
like him, Keith, a little bit weirdly.
Yeah, he's a handsome Muppet, I got to say. Do you guys, I think, a few episodes back, you guys started this own little sort of Loonie Hour, domestic warfare over inflation. And I think we had an inflation data point come out yesterday for Canada.
Yeah, Rich, you've been all over this, so I'll let you take it away.
Yeah, so to not make the mistake that our former dear finance minister made, which was to call the absolute bottom in inflation, remember that? I will speak with a bit more humility and say, a couple of points still don't quite make the trend. But yesterday we got a really, really important inflation print. And it's something that I had sort of been waiting for and angling for and fighting with Steve about. And it's the headline inflation basically sort of blew the expectations out of the water. So remember, there's consensus estimates that are provided every single month for a number of data points, economic, by the way, and financial market, company earnings, GDP, inflation, whatever. And yesterday, the expectations were for inflation to rise a little bit, and it rose a lot. So inflation expectation. So what it was, sorry, I'm pulling it up here. I lost it.
Important context though, right?
Yeah.
Is people are saying, oh, well, the GST holiday is over. So there's, of course there's going to be a boost. So the people are, the economists and markets were already expecting inflation to be higher as a result of this, but it still far exceeded expectations.
Right.
So yeah, I mean, Rich, obviously, I don't know how much of this is to like early days of tariffs, obviously the Canadian dollar.
Well, that's the thing. That's really important. So so remember, all this data is lagging. That's also really important, even though it came out on March 19th or whatever it was, or March 18th, excuse me. It's actually February data. And so headline inflation rose 2.6% or 1.1% on the month. That's a lot. So you shouldn't annualize those data points, but it's quite a bit. And what was expected was 0.6. So almost twice as much as was expected. And as you pointed out, Steve, some of this was already expected, pardon the language, which is that the GST gimmick was sort of unwinding, and people knew that was going to happen. But two of the key points that I thought were really, really important is number one, the headline inflation X mortgage interest cost, which is Steve's favorite, and he has rightly stressed that we should be paying attention to it. He's been doing that for a long time, and rightly so. That is starting to go up higher and higher. So that's now at 2.3%. We're starting to get a couple of data points in a row suggesting inflation's rising, and that's because one of the things that was, one of the sort of the circularity of interest rate hikes and inflation is that the interest rate component was feeding into inflation. Well, that's now no longer as big a deal. So that was really important. And the thing that I look at, and I hope that the Bank of Canada is looking at, is the preferred measures of inflation, which we talk about a lot. And those two of the three were much higher than expected. So, right. So it's only 10 basis points, but with a series like that is really sort of the pure play inflation central tendency. When you have an increase, it's a really meaningful. And this is in the face of record interest rate cuts, right? So I think this puts the BOC in such a jam. I don't know, Keith, if you have a view on that, but I think say it. Tell us what's going to happen with Tiff in Ottawa.
He's a squirmer. But so just to add to that, so I know we're just wrapping up here. The Americans at the Federal Reserve meeting yesterday, It's three amazing things. One, they reduced their estimates for growth, so slowing economy. They increased their estimates for inflation. Exact same thing that you just described, Rich and Steve. We're in the exact same thing. Inflation higher, we're growing slow. But they also they did a stealth rate cut, really, in that they dramatically slowed their QT, the quantitative tightening. And actually, so Michael Nicoletto is one of our other friends that we chat with all the time. He, I think it was just 2 days ago, Michael sent me, and he said, Keith, I expect the Fed to start doing QE within the next couple of months. Like, that's how aggressive that people are starting to see the slowdown happening. So for the Fed to, I forget what the numbers were. I think they went from my numbers are wrong here. Maybe 40 billion a month down to 5, something like that on the QT side. But again, this trend that we're talking about, it's happening. It's one thing to have growth slowing, but if the inflation data is stubborn, I think even the Fed might start to squirm then.
Well, that's what's so interesting, I think, about that's what's so interesting about the BOC, the fact that they cut interest rates to bail out households and baby boomers. That's a conversation for a different day. In the face of what I thought was pretty obvious an inflation rebound. And again, why I think that is because you have a couple of things going on at the same time, which is a weak loonie. Remember, Canadians export oil and import consumer goods. Those consumer goods are priced in other currencies other than the Canadian dollar. So weak dollar makes that expensive. But the other thing is that we were already seeing sort of an impulse, a positive impulse in producer prices, excluding energy. And note that number, and then guess what? Today another print we saw as we're recording, the PPI came out, and again we got more support from the view that inflation is going to continue to rise. So, like the question is now, what does the BOC do? Do they continue to sacrifice the loonie and cut rates, or will they see this inflation rebound as transitory, their favorite word, and sort of look past it? Or are they going to be worried, and they're going to do are they going to stop? Are they going to pause their cuts and sort of become hawkish in order to defend the currency and take into account inflation?
So one real quick final note here. Which country now has the lowest overnight rates in the world?
Switzerland.
Or the lowest tenure, I should say.
Oh, sorry.
It's the Swiss. Remember I told you the Swiss are unpredictable? You got to be wary about these guys. So the Swiss cut rates today to try to devalue the Swiss franc relative to the euro. So again, we keep talking about the currency side. Central banks will react to either defend the currency, or in Switzerland's case, because they export everything they're making over there. It's exciting times. We're just starting, guys.
Just to add to that, more wheels in motion here. Canada's population growth numbers came out. Remember, there was a lot of tightening around the immigration levers there from Mark Miller after a long await. Canada's population growth last quarter was 63,000 quarter over quarter. So the same quarter last year was 270. So we went from 270 growth to 63. So again, still some population growth, but it is clearly the wheels are in motion. We had outflows of about 213,000 temporary residents last quarter alone. So the share of non-permanent residents is still high. It's still at about 7.2%. Remember, the Fed's target is to get that non-permanent resident population down to about 5% over the next couple of years. So it's happening. We're still seeing some growth in population, but the rate of growth has slowed dramatically. Again, going from 1.2 million to what we'll see this year, potentially, maybe it's a couple 100,000. We'll see, but that's something to sort of keep an eye on.
Well, can I just jump in there because I know we got to go, but just one more thing. That's why I'm really quite reluctant to sort of do a Krista Freeland and pump my chest and tell everybody how smart I am about inflation. And that's because of the couple of things that we talked about. One, credit. If credit starts to slow or be constricted by the banks or whoever else, that's going to slow demand, and that's going to hurt inflation at the margin. If consumer confidence continues to weigh on people's investment purchases, their consumption habits, etc. That's also going to weigh on demand and the inflation impulse. And the third thing that you just mentioned, Steve, which is if population continues to fall, that's also going to weigh on consumption, demand, and the inflation impulse. And so although I'm, pretty confident that inflation will continue to follow our ICE cap inflation model, Keith, over the next couple of months, I'm less and less convinced that we're going to see, a huge jump over until next year, et cetera. So I know I'm hedging my bets a little bit, but I think it's really important to sort of have that counterweight.
Yeah, no, I think that's a great place to wrap it up here. There's so much more that we could be chatting about here. There's, a few things I wanted to touch on, but we'll get to another episode because I think there's a lot to talk about. I think moving forward with these elections, what we're going to see is a lot of policy promises, people throwing out these ideas here that I think we're really going to have to unpack on all sides of political parties. And so we'll be bringing on a lot of experts in various spaces across Canada, energy experts, policy experts, et cetera, to really help our listeners hopefully make an educated decision, with this upcoming election, just to understand from all various levels what is right, what is wrong. And so should be good. Like I said, this is an open invite to anyone on the political spectrum, liberal, NDP, conservative. If you want to come on the Loonie Hour, send us a note. We're happy to have that discussion. And as always, guys, we appreciate the support. We'll see you next week.